Hello, Robert. If you can hear me, please please accept the invitation to speak.
Sorry, I didn't see where the little invite thing was. It was up at the top of my screen. Hey, can you guys hear me?
Hey, yeah, loud and
Yes.
clear. And it is a pleasure. We have been eagerly awaiting your arrival. So, just to do introductions, I'm Aaron. I'm hosting today with Kim, a fellow moderator. As you can see, Robert, the turnout here is incredible. Everyone here is clearly already knows who you are, and I'm sure we're all very excited to have you here. So, just a quick heads up, we have the rules channel. Please take a look. You'll also find today's topics here, which were adapted from the pre-submitted questions. So, without further ado, Robert, do you have any pluggables you'd like to plug?
I just got a message from the auto moderator that my post announcing the AMA got deleted for not being long enough. So, I guess, yeah,
It's up. It's stickied. You can ignore that asshole.
that's good. No, I mean you can. I've got a novel out. It collapses one of the things it deals with in a more fun fictional context. You can find it at atrbook.com. It's called After the Revolution. You can also find it as a podcast wherever you find podcasts. But it'll be done completely out by next week, and the whole EPUB will be available for free on atrbook.com. So that's my pluggable.
Great. So I would like to kick this off with our first question. What do mutual aid and resilient communities look like, and how can we cultivate them? How do your experiences in Portland inform you?
Yeah, I think one of the things that's really important and one of the big stumbling blocks when it comes to actually creating a resilient communities is kind of getting over the difference between mutual aid and just charity. And I think a decent number of mutual aid projects, the very well-meaning projects, don't really kind of cross that line. And I think one of the differences is that mutual aid isn't just providing people with stuff they need. It's kind of a way of reorienting the way we organize ourselves and our communities. And I think a good example of mutual aid efforts kind of coming short or running up short is from, and especially within the context of collapse, comes from the towns of Paradise and Chico in Northern California. And I think it was 2018, the Paradise Fire, which is still the largest and most destructive wildfire in California history, I believe, unless it's been beaten by something that just hit, tore through the town of Paradise, destroyed, I think, 18,000 homes, something like that. And just a tremendously destructive fire. And as a result, the population of Chico, which is about 100,000 people nearby, swelled by 20,000 people pretty much overnight. And they were initially met by this huge wave of mutual aid. A lot of people bringing, temporary shelters, bringing them food, setting up places for these people who had just lost their homes, lost everything, to, settle themselves, while they, dealt with the immediate consequences of the fire. But that charity, ran out pretty quickly. And by 2020 or so, the folks who remained, and about 23% of Chico's homeless population at the moment, are people who lost their homes in the Paradise Fire. We're still camping out. We're still living, in tents on public land. But the goodwill towards them had run out, and they were being increasingly criminalized, broken up by police. And in fact, Chico's city council swung hard right, in 2020 as a result of the business association primarily drumming up fear over these encampments and a bunch of harsh language about how, these people were making the community dangerous and making, damaging. Chico, one of the things that Chico's been doing recently is growing as people leave San Francisco, for kind of a chiller small town vibe. So there's a lot of, these folks who initially were welcomed into the community, who had been their neighbors, became kind of a barrier towards making Chico more profitable as folks fled as a result of COVID-19 to places that were a little bit less expensive than San Francisco. So you've got this mix of factors here, right? You've got actual environmental collapse, climate change. You've got kind of these diseases of globalization, this mass plague that suddenly sends a lot of people sweeping out of an expensive city into this small town. And you've got basic greed. And it's led to a situation where these folks who lost their homes in the Paradise Fire are getting swept by cops every week. A couple of them have been killed. A number of them have committed suicide. And it's just this perfect example of where mutual aid, what was at least called mutual aid, I think didn't really cross that barrier. And it was just charity, and charity runs out. I think what Chico needs, and what in a broader sense we all need, is a reorientation of society with among other things, an understanding of what we owe each other, what people owe their neighbors, what people owe fellow members of their community. And that includes everything from like the kind of care that we need to give people when their lives are disrupted like this, to the kind of care we need to take with our environment, in order to make stuff like this less common. And like, as we all kind of accommodate ourselves to the fact that a lot of the worst parts of climate change are going to come, a lot of the worst things, at least, that we had been warned about are inevitable now, because we cannot reverse the process that has been started. The only thing that, in my opinion, can move the future we're looking at from something pretty nightmarish to something livable is a reorientation of our understanding of what we owe each other. And I guess that's what mutual aid means to me.
Well, so we have Flap the Satch here who wants to add a follow-up question.
Hi there. So you spent some time observing protests and mutual aid networks while covering and participating in the Portland protests. Have you seen any patterns regarding which of these groups have endured since then? Do you think there are differences between local networks that developed for these protests and movements versus those one might want to build around climate issues specifically? And is longevity of groups important, or is it okay if they start and end based on local stressors? Thank you.
Yeah, I think the longevity of individual groups is not as important as longevity of the kind of cultural changes that come with a popular understanding of the value of mutual aid. I think Portland has done actually a really good job of that. I have a lot of criticisms of the protests in Portland and kind of where they've gone, and there's a lot of, to put it in brief, a lot of what was last year a very formidable movement capable of confronting armed federal agents in the streets turned into people yelling at each other on Twitter. But what didn't collapse were the mutual aid networks. They've continued to grow. I think a lot of people who, for whatever reason, didn't want to either decided that there's not a point right now in going out and protesting, or I've got too many charges on me, or too much trauma. A lot of those people may not be going out and yelling at police stations every night, but they're still participating in different mutual aid organizations. And I think that's, number one, assuming things pop up again at some point in the future, protest-wise, it will mean that Portland has a more stable base to spring off of next time. But I think it also provides a lot of opportunity for the stuff that's necessary to deal with what climate change is bringing. We saw that last year, right? When the fires hit last year, all of these people who had spent the last couple of months getting not just hardened against violence, but better and better at providing disaster aid. And in that case, it was a disaster caused by law enforcement. But they'd gotten good at it, and they were able to provide a lot of, the first day that the city got blanketed in smoke, I showed up at this parking lot where hundreds and hundreds of people and thousands of pounds of supplies had been assembled and were being gotten out to people who'd had to evacuate, who were, either in, camping or were set up in municipal buildings. A lot of resources were deployed very quickly, more than I saw the local government deploying for those purposes. And it was, not only good from just a humanitarian standpoint, but from a viewpoint, I'm always thinking of this kind of clash that we have with the violent right, the fascist right. It was extremely useful in terms of that conflict. We had access, me and a couple of other researchers had access to the internal chats of an organization called Patriot Coalition, which was attempting to bring together Proud Boys and Patriot Prayer and a number of other kind of smaller militia-style right-wing groups in the area. And the thing that scared them the most was the efficacy of the mutual aid networks that were formed around the fires, because they recognized it as extremely effective, as an extremely effective kind of insurgent method. Like, that's what you want to do if you want to win any kind of conflict, right? Your primary goal is to build support among the people, right? If you're an insurgent, or whoever you are, the battleground is in the hearts and minds of the people around you. And I think that the anti-fascist movement, not that it was all anti-fascists who were involved in the mutual aid networks, but that mutual aid was one of the most effective single acts of anti-fascism, that I saw in 2020. And so I think that Portland has done a better job than most places of getting a really good vision of mutual aid as not just like, I'm providing resource X to person Y, but as a member of a community, I am engaged in supporting my community members, and I know that they will support me. And this isn't something that I'm not relying on the government. I'm not relying on the city or the state to handle these basic needs. I recognize that my basic needs will be filled by the people in my community, but also that their basic needs are my responsibility to help fill, right? And I think Portland's done as many criticisms as I might have about other aspects of the protest movement in Portland. I think it's done an incredible job of getting that down. And that's really the most important thing in terms of seeing us through to the future. And I think one of the reasons Portland is so interesting, as someone, doing the things that I do and covering the same sort of things that we all do, is that I felt for a while that they're, 4 or 5 years ahead of the rest of the country, not in a forward thinking sense, but just in a sense of these trends and forces that are nationwide. It's been hitting Portland faster. The kind of street conflicts between right and left happened here earlier at a higher level of intensity. And we're seeing a lot of environmental strain hitting, a lot of climate change, shit hitting Portland fast. The wildfires last year, the smoke that they were blanketed in is now the situation you're seeing in New York, right? Even the wildfires that are causing it are largely in Oregon. These kind of massive heat dome effects hit here earlier than they hit a lot of places. And I think you're going to continue. I don't know. There's a number of reasons for that, but I think it remains an interesting place to look, because it keeps being the site of these things that are go on to become more common nationally. And I hope that the kind of mutual aid framework that has been set up in Portland is something that goes viral, so to speak, because I do think, I know for a fact that a number of mutual aid networks and individuals who are organizers in other cities look to Portland for that kind of stuff. I think it's the thing that we've done the best job of here.
Well, thank you for your insights. With respect to the violent right, we were also curious. After the events of January 6th, it seemed like the tensions that had been building suddenly disappeared. We're curious what your take is, and how do the added tensions within the context of the COVID recession play into this?
See, that's fascinating. I remember, when I looked through the thread about this earlier, I saw that question had been on there, and I'm incredibly interested by the fact that a number of people feel that way, that like it feels like the tension's dissipated. And this may be, I can't tell you if my perspective here is objectively correct. But to me, it seems as if they've only heightened, right? And maybe that's because, you find what you look for, right? So if you hang out on a subreddit about collapse, you find more reasons to believe collapse is coming. If you're the kind of person who spends all of your time reading what Nazis say on the internet and obsessing over all of these different groups, perhaps you come to believe that, the conflict is more advanced or more serious or whatever than perhaps it is. But to me, I am seeing a lot of things that really concern me. And the thing that frightens me most in terms of an active threat is that I I think I see more mainstream conservative buy-in to what were very fringe talking points about stuff like replacement theory, right? Stuff that 3 years ago I would have only found in, really, really dark corners of the internet on like 8chan or something. I'm seeing versions of that talked about on Fox News by guys like Tucker Carlson. That worries the hell out of me. I'm also seeing more widespread acceptance among normal conservatives of people like Proud Boys, of militia. You're seeing this kind of widespread effort to rebrand, and the former president is taking part in this, to rebrand the Capitol insurrection as an act of patriotism and to celebrate. I think there's a real threat of Ashley Babbitt turning into kind of the Horst Wessel of an American fascist movement. So for me, I feel as if, there have been, not to say that it's all been negative. One of the upsides is that the most effective and prominent street organizers of the fascist right are in jail now. A lot of them, a significant number of them, and guys who worried me, like Joe Biggs, which are guys that are both street organizers and had combat experience. A lot of those folks did get taken out of pocket. And I think it's good that there's been such blowback, among liberals against this, which, it's never all one way or the other. I see a lot of reasons to be worried. I do think there's a broader understanding of the threat that these groups face, of the fact that at least people are naming it fascism a lot more now and are naming kind of what we're seeing on the fascism poison chunks of the right as what it is. So that does give me some hope. But I definitely don't feel like I've seen it subside, I have seen news coverage of it subside. And so it does make sense, I think, that would be people's interpretation. But I don't think that I've actually seen the amount of violence or the amount of organization subsiding. I think that one of the things that I've been paying attention to right now is what's been happening in Los Angeles, where right-wing media ginned up a controversy about a trans person in a spa, like a Korean spa, one of those 24-hour places where you go to do salt baths and whatever.
Gosh. Just oh my
What?
gosh, that's just oh my gosh, reacting to what you're saying.
Yeah, and so on two different occasions there have been anti-trans rallies ginned up as Protect the Children rallies out in front of this place, and they've turned into massive street fights. And when I say street fights, there have been some clashes between fascists and anti-fascists. It's mostly been the LAPD coming in and just beating the hell out of people. They shot a woman at damn near point blank range with a rubber round just 2 or 3 days ago, and did some serious damage, and just a lot of ugly, ugly shit. And this kind of thing that worries me the most, which is when you see law enforcement working with these kind of right-wing militant groups, which is obviously happens a lot. It's not the only way these things go. And I think that folks on the left sometimes flatten particularly federal law enforcement into one group. There's a lot of folks in law enforcement who don't like these organizations. And I think broadly speaking, it's at least good if they're not working together, because they're a lot more dangerous when they do work together, which is what we've been seeing in Los Angeles, is the most violent and racist police department in the United States working directly with Proud Boys, and doing tremendous violence to people. And that worries the hell out of me. So I don't know. I try not to be a doomer about things, but I definitely don't see things as on a lower ebb since the 6th.
Sure. A Myth of Progress is here and has a follow-on question. Can you join the stage, please?
My question is as follows. Thank you for being here today, Mr. Evans. I am Myth of Progress, and I have a question. Many years ago, I saw a documentary called If a Tree Falls, A Story of the Earth Liberation Front. In this documentary, they noted that the primary concern for terrorism, namely the American state apparatus, immediately prior to 9/11, was eco-terrorism. Nearly 20 years have passed since then, and almost all environmental movements in the West, such as Extinction Rebellion, are painfully pacifist, devoutly performative, and ultimately ineffectual, even though history tells us that change only comes from radical action and not incrementalist talk. So, with that background, my questions are as follows. First, Why do you think that the North American environmental movement has lost its radical arm, such as promoting industrial sabotage or property damage over the past 2 years, well, 2 decades? And second, do you see more radical elements of the environmental movement gaining popularity and traction over the next few years? And if so, how do you think this will play out on the public stage? I want you to...
Oh, you cut out for a second. Hello? Yeah.
I did that. This is Kim. That was
Oh.
2 questions. I thought that was plenty.
Oh, okay. Yeah, so, I mean, the first part of that I would answer is, like, why do I think that died out? Why is that not a major factor in left-wing activism anymore? The kind of direct action, environmental kind of, and particularly, like, direct action aimed at damaging infrastructure. Because of the green scare, you know, late 90s, I think, early 2000s is when a lot of that hit. And the FBI in particular, I think it was primarily the FBI, was incredibly successful in rolling up different groups of radical environmental activists and just destroyed these people's lives. There would be these horrific grand juries where they would find, you know, people, it was often people getting charged years after they had been active. And so folks who had for a year or two been active in kind of radical environmental like direct action, you know, and then went on, had kids and stuff, would suddenly be like threatened with like, well, you know, you either roll on your friends, submit to this grand jury, or you're going to jail right now for not being on the grand jury. You're going to lose your kids. You're going to lose your family. You're going to like, and they just bulldozed human lives in the Green Scare. I mean, it really is some harrowing. A lot of the most active and most effective activists of that kind of generation killed themselves in prison because they were getting terrorism enhancements on sentences, 20 years and stuff. You've seen a version of that that's hit. It's been lighter, but it's been pretty ugly with kind of response to different pipeline protests, Standing Rock and the like. But the reason, in short, that like that's not a major part of activism here is that the consequences of engaging in that activism are horrific. You have to effectively, if you're going to go out and, I don't know, spike trees or try to destroy pipeline infrastructure or whatever, you have to be willing to give your whole life up for that action, because that may very well be the consequence. So I think it's just a natural consequence of people, the most dedicated people, the folks who couldn't be scared off, were destroyed by the system or are still in prison. And a lot of other folks decided, okay, well, let's try something else. And I would tend to agree with you about the sentiment that incrementalism cannot solve the climate problems we have. It absolutely cannot. We're well beyond that being any possible solution now. I think another aspect is that I don't think the kind of direct actions people were engaging in are capable of solving the problem either. There's a J.R.R. Tolkien quote I quite like. It was from a letter he was sending to his son Christopher, where he was like, you know, I think it's a wonderful idea for patriotic citizens to go out and destroy factories and power stations. But unless they have mass popular support for those actions, it won't lead to anything. And I think that's kind of the problem, right? If you have isolated cases of small cells of people doing damage to oil and gas infrastructure or whatever, that's not going to, unless some sort of mass public movement starts around that sort of thing, it's not going to sweep into something larger. It's going to be kind of like you got with a lot of the property destruction protests in Portland, where it's like, well, some windows got broken, some businesses have minor structural damage, but the system itself was not derailed by this. It's a more durable system than that. So I think one of the things that is necessary is a kind of reappraisal of what effective radical action means in a climate context. And I don't think it means what it used to mean, because I think that didn't work. And we can debate the reasons why it didn't work, but it number one, it got suppressed to the point where people stopped participating in that stuff, but also that stuff didn't, you know, not across the board, because you can, I mean, there's, I don't want to like be making sort of grand pronouncements about this very long fight, but I think there needs to be an acknowledgement that, well, yes, incrementalism isn't the answer. The old methods of radical environmental resistance aren't necessarily aren't the only thing we should be looking at, because they didn't do the trick, you know? And we still have the same realities on the ground. You're still dealing with the same kind of federal law enforcement apparatus. It's only gotten more capable in some ways. And while there's other aspects of the situation that are different, including you have folks who you have the consequences of allowing this kind of environmental destruction are much clearer and have had a larger impact on a larger chunk of the population now. So people are more, I don't know, pilled, if you want to use that term. I still think the actual kind of action that's going to lead to a solution, or that's going to mitigate seriously the harm being done to the environment, I don't know that people have figured that out yet. I know folks have theories, but I don't know exactly how to. I mean, the only thing I can think of is actually building mass for a general strike. Because because the kind of action, if you're talking about radical action that will actually stop the damage being done to the climate and allow for the kind of adaptations that will let us survive the changes that are already inevitable, you're talking about getting enough people on board that you can choke the system in such a way and with such speed that the crackdown, the clampdown can't reverse it. That you can't, it's the thing we saw in the uprising last year. You get enough people who are willing to support any kind of radical action with enough critical mass, you can forestall certain responses to that action. So I don't know. I continue to think a general strike, as difficult a task as that is the best chance we have for long-term mitigation of the kind of problems that we're looking at.
Thanks for that detailed answer. I noticed that a lot of questions that have been coming through are linking the rise of tension and violence in the States with your new book. We were curious, your world building for after the revolution is very interesting. What kind of basic assumptions did you make to shape your image of the future?
I mean, the most basic assumption was that all of the different trends that I've seen socially are just going to continue. They're just going to get bigger. So, I mean, one of the things there is that it was important to me not to portray the religious extremists as a unified bloc. You have your statist, in my book, you have your statist Christian, kind of capitalist Christian, prosperity gospel type folks, which I think would be which is the larger chunk of them in the United States today. And I think would be the larger chunk in any sort of, like, if you actually see the country balkanize. And these are kind of like your religious right? These are the Jerry Falwell types. And I see them getting a state. I know there's a bunch of them who want a state. And then on the other hand of things, you have your more radical, anti-state, because any state is really just a separation between people and Christ. Those kind of radicals. And I thought it was important to display, to include that sort of those different kind of cultures within the radical right is eventually evolving into separate movements. Once they're no longer really necessarily fighting on the same side, against, liberal culture. And I saw things breaking down in sort of separations between, not just East and West, but, between kind of like corporate capitalism, a kind of more democratic socialism, and then more radical tendencies that I don't think would be likely to gain huge chunks of territory. But I think I imagine in this period after a period of economic collapse and environmental collapse, there's a lot of open territory for people to try shit in. So, I mean, that was the most important thing for me in terms of the predictive elements of my novel. I do want to note, if you want to see what I think a kind of doggedly realistic look at conflict in the United States, that's it could happen here. I put a bunch of ridiculous fun shit in after the revolution, like cyberware, and that at times borders on magical, because I thought that was fun, right? At the end of the day, it could happen here was not fun to write. It was not fun to research. And after the revolution was fun to write. And that was the only way I could write 130,000 words of fiction. You have to find a way to make it fun for yourself and fun for the audience. So I do want to note that, like, while there's, I think, elements of predictiveness in there that are fairly accurate, including, the way I depict, radicalization happening, and the way I depict like extremist groups recruiting through the internet. It was also a book that I wrote because I wanted to write a fun book that people would enjoy reading. So I don't want to like portray it as like, this is what I think is absolutely going to happen, you know?
Yeah, for sure. Related to the fun of it, Brick Nidges had a follow-up question. Oh, I need to invite him. Sorry. Brick, you need to accept the invitation to speak.
Sorry. On your book, After the Revolution, which character do you relate to the most, and why is it Skullfucker Mike? But in all seriousness, as a longtime fan of Behind the Bastards, I can see your voice in all of them, and I'm curious to see who you really relate to the most.
I don't know that there's one I relate to the most. You know, all of them have elements of my person. And the way that I wrote each of the characters in there is I took elements from friends of mine, people I've met around the world. I've been fortunate enough to know a lot of really incredible people over the course of my lifetime. And so I took the best elements of their personalities and put them into people like Skullfucker Mike. And I also took the worst elements of my own personality, and I particularly seeded the viewpoint characters with those. So Manny's got a lot of my more mercenary streaks in it, which is why I've been successful under capitalism. I have that aspect of myself, and the specific kind of escapism that goes with that, which is the recognition that like, oh, where I live is fucked up. I'm going to make enough money to get the fuck out of here. Right. That's very much based on a significant chunk of my life. Sasha is based, there's elements of me in her. She's also based very heavily on a good friend of mine who was born into the Quiverful movement. So she was one of, I think, 10 children. And was raised to be like, was raised to breed children for a holy war, right? That's like literally what her childhood was about. And she broke out, and Sasha's had kind of the opposite journey. And I think the elements of Sasha that are me are particularly in kind of how she relates to her parents and the society she came from, because she's aptly diagnosed its ills. She's just picked, a very wrong remedy for them. And then Roland, the aspects of Roland that are most based off of me is how he deals with trauma, which should be a hint that I don't deal with trauma in a particularly healthy manner. Generally, self-isolation and drug abuse historically have been how I've handled those things, which doesn't work in the long run, but in the short run works great, especially if you have enough drugs. So yeah, I hope that answers your question.
Oh, that's fun. Thank you so much. Gecko here has another follow-up question related to After the Revolution.
Yes, you've spoken about how you grew up with D&D and Shadowrun and such, and I was just wondering if you've considered adapting After the Revolution into a setting for a tabletop role-playing game of any sort, or a full game of itself. I think games really have a lot of potential to like get people to consider the implications of a setting. More than just reading through. And also, I have a lot of fun with After the Revolution as a setting. You've done some excellent world building there, and I think it'd be really fun to play in.
Yeah, I tend to think that Dungeons and Dragons or D&D, and when I say D&D, I'm referring to any kind of like tabletop role-playing game. Because when my friends and I would play, we would play Shadowrun, we would play GURPS, we would play Gamma World, we would play Dungeons and Dragons. But it was always just like, oh, we're going over to Roger's house to play D&D. So anyway, that I tend to think D&D is just about the best way you could spend time as a person. And I'm very bummed that I have not played any kind of role-playing game in 3 or 4 or 5 years, something like that. I miss it really badly. So I guess the answer is yes. I'd be psyched if someone was to do that. If someone or some company wanted to adapt my books to a role-playing game. I don't have enough time to do all the things that I'm supposed to do. I'm kind of chronically overcommitted, and can't see any time in the immediate future when I would be able to like put serious work in to a role-playing game. Particularly if some company wanted to come in and, especially if it was like done under the Open Gaming Initiative, so people could have free access to the rule set, or at least the base rule set. I would be happy to like consult on that and make sure that they got the stuff right to my understanding of the setting I've built. But I don't see myself having time to do it in the near future. Although that sounds much more enjoyable than my day job, which is stalking fascist militias on the internet and writing podcasts about rapists and dictators.
Thank you, Robert. We have lots of D&D players around here, and I think you're going to find some people have taken your offer to heart, and you may be getting pitches.
Yeah, I mean, I welcome any kind of adaptations people want to do. That said, I don't know. I'm a big fan of D20 based games. That's always been, I think that I will, until the day I die, if I never pick up another book, still be able to play Pathfinder or 3.5. It's just like burnt into my soul in a way that none of I've played a couple of different editions of Shadowrun. I couldn't tell you how to play any of them, even though I spent years doing it when I was younger. Could not run you through, Gamma World. I don't even fucking remember what kind of dice-based Gamma World was. But I think if I never played another game of D&D in 40 years, I could run a fucking Pathfinder campaign.
I think it's fair to say that for a lot of us here, you're a role model. And we had some specific questions around this. I wanted to open it up to Sock, who has a personal question.
For aspiring conflict journalists, I, myself being one, what, in your opinion, is the best way to get into the field? I know you didn't get into it in the most traditional route, but I'm just curious to hear your opinion. Thanks.
The only way to get into it, unless you're already a journalist, right? If you're already a journalist, then the way to get into it is build enough connections with publishers and editors that you can pitch them a story in a conflict zone and then go do it, right? But if you're not already a journalist, then I don't know any way to do it but to just go there and do a story. And you got to go there with an idea of the story you want to get. But you get it's very unlikely that your experience, if you want to get into conflict journalism, even if you are a journalist, it's very unlikely that you will be able to get someone to pay for you to go. Because budgets are constantly being slashed. It's the easiest thing for places for different outlets to cut, especially since there's always local stringers hungry to sell footage and such. So it is probably going to be the kind of situation, unless you're very established as a journalist, that you're going to need to pay for your own trip to wherever. That being stated, the most important thing to do when you are looking at traveling to a conflict zone and doing reporting there is finding a good fixer. And the best way to do that is to look at the coverage that has already been done in that area. Find the coverage, the specific journalist or journalists whose coverage you respect the most. Reach out to them however you can and ask them, who is your fixer? And get advice that way. And especially if you reach out to a couple of people and the same name keeps popping up, that's your motherfucking guy. And then you reach out to that person and you tell him your idea for a story and you get his advice on it or her advice on it. And you pay them whatever it is they ask. You don't haggle with a good fixer. And you don't argue with them also, especially in the field. You do exactly what they say. And you take their advice because their job is to make sure you don't die and they don't die either. So that's my practical advice for doing that kind of work, which I am not hugely great at. I think I consider myself firmly in the middle of the pack there. If you're looking for really good books on combat journalism, conflict journalism, written by one of the best in the business, I always suggest Sebastian Junger's War. Junger is an exceptional writer and one of the most experienced conflict journalists in modern history. So I would send you his way. And of course, I think Jake Hanrahan's podcast, Popular Front, which I'm sure a lot of people in the audience are fans of, gives you great kind of context to what's going on in the world of conflict and conflict reporting, and you can learn a lot from staying current with that.
Thank you. The Doom Scroller has a follow-up question for the After the Revolution topic.
Okay, so how fleshed out is the Blackstone Nation concept, and could that be a future setting in another movie?
It's moderately fleshed out. One of the things I have, without getting into too much detail, I've known a couple of people in a couple of states who have family and friends who are involved in different gangs, and it's always kind of been clear to me that in any kind of collapse scenario that's a political collapse, those organizations aren't just going to like fade away. A number of them are going to have not necessarily even ambitions, but just like a lot of them are just kind of representative of different groups of people in different regional areas. And like there's, you've even seen a little bit of that in the right wing, left wing conflicts over LA of like some folks kind of getting, being like, well, I don't want these motherfuckers walking around in my neighborhood. Like we should do something about this. So I think that there's an element of just kind of recognizing that. And the Blackstone Nation is always an interesting historical case because they are both. There's an element of that group that is just another kind of gang. And then there was an element of it that was so much more ambitious and interesting than that. And of course they still exist in a form. And I don't know how realistic it is to think that like that specific organization would, but I think I'm using their name and kind of what they achieved at their height as an idea for like, yes, in short, it's something I've thought a bit about, and it's definitely something that I think could be a good, focus for a good, like, it's definitely a place I would like to explore more in a future, in like a sequel. Although I believe currently the sequel that I'm in the early stages of working on is going to be set more in, New Mexico, Arizona, Utah, Southwest, Colorado, that chunk. I mean, I have to, for the novels, I'm taking sort of the same journey I have in my own life because that's the journey that defines the parts of the country I know the best. And after Texas, it's the Southwest. So, yeah.
Very cool. Brainslet's here, and he has more of a question about your personal insights related to the last topic.
Brainslet, are you muted?
I think he sometimes he has data issues. Oh, there you go.
Hello, sorry about that.
Good.
So in your interview with Margaret Killjoy, you mentioned having read basically only Bookchin for anarchist theory. I'm curious what hooked you. Were you inspired by his focus on praxis, or do you just like him because he's grumpy and hilarious?
So it's not just only Bookchin, but Bookchin's the only stuff that's really like stuck to a significant degree. Like the first anarchist theory I read was I've gotten most of the way through it a couple of times, was No Gods, No Masters, the collection by AK Press, which has like a bunch of Proudhon and stuff in it. That said, I'm not a theory guy. What I like about Bookchin is twofold. Number one, a significant chunk of his theories are being tested right now in a way that is incredibly interesting. And that is also provides opportunity to like analyze how well they work, right? So that's something I find interesting. The other thing I find interesting about him is that, as I understand it, a lot of his ideas that kind of, have been turned in Northeast Syria into democratic confederalism and then, libertarian municipalism, like a lot of the kind of theoretical ideas he was working with were based around what he thought would work due to the cultural context of the United States. And I see a lot of hope in that. And I find it very interesting because I think, particularly the cause of like state communism and even state socialism, in the United States is kind of hopeless because of, the degree to which people's minds have been poisoned against it, the degree to which people have visceral reactions to terms like communism. Meanwhile, I think just on a practical level, if you're trying to talk to somebody about a different way things could be organized, you're sitting down with a rural, farming family in the Midwest or in nowhere, California, and you start with the phrase libertarian. Well, you're already on a better track than if you're trying to talk them into any kind of socialism. And then you can explain, I think the focus on regional, autonomy, on not having these, because I think one of the big issues we have that's driving a lot of violence and a lot of conflict in the United States is at the national level, you have rural areas and low population rural areas that are hugely empowered over urban areas, right? Where voters in these states like Wyoming have significantly more power per person because of the way our system works than people living in, Los Angeles, or people living in Detroit, or people living in Minneapolis. And that's unjust. But at the state level, you also have these huge cities like Portland and Oregon, or, the big cities in California that completely dominate the legislatures, that completely dominate lawmaking, and governance in states over the rural areas. And so this is a constant driver of conflict. And I think a system that attempts to, in a very formal way, function as part of a larger whole for the bigger problems in which that's necessary, but also is based firmly around avoiding this aspect of where one group of people completely dominates another. I think that has a lot of promise to me, just given the current problems that we're facing. So I guess, as a not expert on literally anything, what I like about Bookchin is I think his ideas are easy to sell to the people they need to be sold to. And I think they offer a remedy to the problem that worries me the most socially in the country right now.
Which is?
That a lot of people want to kill their neighbors.
Okay. Thank you for clarifying.
The large and increasing numbers of Americans want to kill large and increasing numbers of other Americans. And that we have 400 million or so guns to do it with. I don't think that's a good situation.
And makes me think of Alex Jones. Say, we have 2 more questions here queued up. Drama has a question about personal resilience for you.
Hi, yeah. So with the way the world is going right now, it's hard to feel the kind of motivation that you need to keep doing radical work. How do you stop yourself from doom spiraling, and how do you keep looking at bad things happening in the world without losing all hope?
I'm better at that on some days than on others. So I want to start this with a very gentle criticism of the subreddit. I spend some time on y'all's subreddit, and I found value in it, particularly in research. I also think it's really bad to spend too much time there, and I don't think it's bad because bad information is percolating. I think it's bad because, again, it's when you focus entirely on evidence of collapse, it becomes inevitable, in your mind at least. And I think one of the things that you can do as an activist, as just a human being who's paying attention to the world, to reduce the amount of kind of doom strain, and the emotional exhaustion that comes with it, the compassion fatigue, right? It's compassion fatigue is a big part of what we're talking about, is to actively seek out more optimistic stories. And sometimes the only way to do that, not just like through trying to find happy stories about things going on online, but going out into the world to do it. I think that's one of the benefits that mutual aid has, is that helping people tends to help your mental state. It's certainly better for your mental state than, for example, organizing a protest at a police station that ends in tear gas. Not that that's not necessary sometimes, but one of those things leaves me more optimistic than the other. I also think it's important to focus on, or to spend time at least trying to research how things could work out well, right? And I think this is a problem that a lot of us have. It's certainly a problem I have, which is when you study the problems and you keep trying to think about what's going to happen next, it's again easy to ignore positive signs, to ignore good things that are happening, and even to ignore the possibility that things might improve. And that's hard to do right now because the situation is dire. And I'm not trying to, I think the unhealthy version of my advice is saying, hey, well, look on the bright side. And okay, but there's not really a bright side to environmental collapse. But there is a bright side to the way human beings are responding to it. And there's good stories out there. I'm currently reading a book right now that's definitely written by a fairly liberal dude, but has a good story. And it's called We Fed an Island. And it's about the mutual aid kitchens that were established in Puerto Rico after Hurricane Maria. And it's got a lot of really interesting information. It's also very optimistic because these people fed 3 million folks. It's mutual aid that verged on the kind of scale that's actually necessary to enable something like a general strike. Another book that I've been reading recently that is both, I think, very kind of, steely-eyed look at the problem, but also not in a doomorous way, is called Disposable City by Mario Alejandro Ariza. And it's about Miami, and it's about the fact that Miami's doomed. But it's also about the resiliency of the community and different ways in which the community might manage to survive and adapt. And it's written in such a way that even though it's dealing with a heavy topic, and even though it is really dealing with collapse in a lot of ways, it's not, it doesn't leave me feeling, it's not like The Uninhabitable Earth, also a great book, is hard to read, for the reason that it's got a lot of important things to say. But I don't know. I guess, my advice is go out of your way to find stories about people in desperate situations doing good things and making their situations better, because those stories are important, and both actual stories and also I think fiction. I think one of the things that's been consistently underrated, by everyone, but particularly by the left, is the value of fiction in providing people with the possibility of optimism about the future. I don't think we have enough of it now. I don't think we've had enough of it for a while. And it certainly is rarely what's popular. And I think I wish there's optimistic elements of my book. I kind of wish I'd gone out of my way to make a more optimistic book, but I wrote after the revolution when I was out of my mind on PTSD in 2017 primarily. And, I was not able to be as optimistic as perhaps I would have been if I'd been in a better mind state. But I don't know. I think radical optimism is necessary. It's a survival tactic. It's as crucial to your survival in what's coming as keeping a tourniquet on you,
Thank you for those resources, Robert. Speaking of ignoring positive signs and focusing on inevitable collapse and doom strain, Reckoner has one final question.
Unmute, Reckoner.
All right, let's try this again. Thank you, and a pleasure to talk to you. If you ever find yourself,
the Netscape logo.
Yeah, man, thanks. It's an easy way to separate the old heads and the new, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Also appreciate the story you did on old Billy Boy. If you ever happen to find yourself in Southeast Alabama, man, hit me up. I'll be happy to buy the first round.
Thank you.
How long before you think we see a politician running on an eco-fascist platform within and without the U.S.? Considering we may not have already seen it, how long before you think we do?
Oh boy. I don't think it'll be long. I don't think they'll call themselves eco-fascists, obviously, right? But I think that's coming, and I think the fact that the material consequences of climate change are becoming increasingly unavoidable and obvious to even people who have been long-term deniers, means that can't be far away. There's we actually talked to one of the authors of this book, Garrison and I today, Climate Leviathan, A Political Theory of Our Planetary Future by Joel Wainwright and Jeff Mann. Jeff Mann, I don't know. I just talked to him and I fucked his name up. But it's a good book because it kind of lays out, broadly speaking, what the major state kind of reactions to climate change are likely to be. And Climate Leviathan was the term it came up with for kind of the welding of different neoliberal efforts transnationally into what will probably be a very authoritarian and probably largely ineffective attempt to deal with climate change. But it also posits, in a kind of fascist response, and particularly based around probably identitarianism, either of the national kind or even of the racial kind. But I think that's coming. It's going to be a thing we're going to have to deal with, no matter what winds up winning. And kind of largely, what you're probably going to have in terms of the large scale responses, at least proposed to climate change, you're going to have one of them, what Mann and Wainwright call climate leviathan, is going to be an acceleration of the state responses to climate change we've seen so far. So stuff like gas taxes that, you can make it, it's easy to see why politicians argue for it, but is not as effective as they ever want it to be, and also increases division and anger between groups of people because it primarily hurts folks who are part of a chunk of the population that contributes less to climate change, rural folks, than it does urban folks. You're going to see stuff like that. You're going to see probably, one of the things that I think is kind of a prediction of the future is what you've seen in Texas with companies taking control of people's thermostats to limit how cool they can set their homes. You're going to see stuff like that. So it's going to be a very top down. It's going to be very one size fits all. And it's going to be the kind of solutions that the Joe Bidens and the like, can get on board with, because none of them are solutions that in any way reduce the power of the state or the political class. So that's one chunk of responses to climate change. I think that will spawn at least an attempt at a climate an eco-fascist regime, which will be based around anger at a lot of the policies pushed by the kind of neoliberals, a desire to, well, why do we care about the global climate? Let's just worry about building a system that protects our people. I think that's one possibility. I think there's a possibility for kind of a broader transnational eco-fascist movement, although I don't currently see the bones of that lying around. And I think you'll probably see, particularly centered on, I think, the kind of climate leviathan model that Wainwright and Mann propose is likely for kind of the EU, the United States, NATO countries, all that stuff. I think you're also likely to see an effort led by China that is a different kind of an authoritarian response to climate change, and perhaps in a lot of ways a more effective one. I don't think any of these are ideal. And I think one of the things you're likely to see as part of the climate leviathan is a big corporate response to climate change. And what I'm talking about is the response of capital to climate change. When it can no longer be denied, the move that capital is going to make on a big scale is like, well, let's make capital an irremovable part of the solution. So let's have the changes that are going to be necessary, the infrastructure changes, and also potentially stuff like cloud seeding or whatever. Let's have the private sector do those things. And one of the things that would enshrine is the necessity of the private sector, the necessity of the companies in a lot of cases that got us into this problem, right? Because we're making them a critical part of the solution. And that scares the hell out of me, as it should scare the hell out of everyone else, because obviously these are the people who got us into the problem, and they're going to pitch a solution. And I think in both kind of main authoritarian possibilities for responses to climate change, they're going to be, that's going to be dominant. Whether you're talking about whatever winds up, being led by the Chinese government, whatever lines up being led by, Western nations, I think you're going to have these corporate interests pitching themselves as big parts of the solution. And I think, when I look at what I think is the most ideal solution to our problems, it is not a state-based solution. It is heavily based around reordering people's understanding of their community. And it's also not one size fits all. It's going to look different in different places. If you're looking at what's actually the best possible way to move forward, it's not going to be the kind of one size fits all authoritarian clampdown that I think, any given powerful state is going to focus on. And I think one of the problems that we have if we're pushing for this more optimistic response to climate change that isn't based around, that isn't primarily based around using the state as a cudgel to force things through. I think one of the issues is that all of these actors that I consider to be more or less, these actors that are themselves the people who got us into this problem, right? The federal governments of a number of different nations, these giant corporations, these right-wing extremists, all of the solutions they're going to pitch are going to be based primarily around promising people a return to the kind of lives they used to live before climate change fucks shit up. They'll be saying you could get coffee back on the shelves once we stop being able to buy coffee. They'll be saying we'll make sure that you have access to meat again once it starts being difficult to get beef. They'll be saying we'll keep the lights on when power becomes less reliable. And they will be promising people something that they know, which is always real easy. It's why that's what authoritarians always do. They'll be promising people something they know. And those of us who kind of want to fundamentally reorganize society in order to make it less extractive, make it less abusive, make it less based around inequality, and make it healthier and more survivable for everybody. That's not something anyone knows what that looks like, really, right? Unless you're one of those people who just says we got to do a Soviet Union again. You're proposing something that's never been done. And it's always harder to propose something that's never been done than it is to say, I'm just going to give you back these things you lost because, oops, me and my friends destroyed the climate. Sorry, that was kind of a meandering response.
Robert, thank you so much for joining us. What an amazing opportunity to pick your brain. That's all we have here for the voice portion of the AMA, and I just wanted to ask everyone to please join me in thanking Robert Evans. And if you haven't, please check out his GoFundMe for the sequel to After the Revolution. We're excited to have you stick around to answer some questions on Reddit, and I will start copying over some of the pre-submitted questions. Thanks again.
Yeah, thank you.
You have quite a few devotees in the audience here, and I'm sure they've just been thrilled. I've had a great time listening and bringing people on and off the stage. Thanks for your time, Robert.
Yeah, thank you for setting all this up. I really appreciate it. This has been a lot of fun.